In the summer of 1845, two ships, the pride of the Royal Navy, sailed north into the ice and vanished from the face of the earth. They were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, vessels specifically fortified to conquer the harshest environment on the planet. Aboard were 129 men, hand-picked officers and crew, led by a seasoned, celebrated hero of Arctic exploration, Sir John Franklin. Their mission was to achieve a goal that had obsessed European powers for centuries: to chart the final, unnavigated section of the fabled Northwest Passage and claim the glory for the British Empire. They were equipped with the most advanced technology the Victorian era could provide. Their hulls were reinforced with iron plates to withstand the crushing force of the ice packs. They carried auxiliary steam engines for auxiliary power in a world dominated by sail. And in their holds they had a 3-year supply of provisions, much of it preserved in tin cans, a recent innovation believed to be the key to long-term survival. They were a symbol of industrial might and imperial confidence, a floating testament to the belief that no corner of the globe was beyond the reach of man. They were last seen by the crews of 2 whaling ships in Baffin Bay, waiting for the ice to clear before plunging into the labyrinth of the Arctic archipelago. And then there was only silence. For years, the silence was absolute. The expedition, expected to emerge triumphant into the Pacific Ocean within 2 or 3 years, simply disappeared. What followed was one of the largest and longest search efforts in history, a desperate, decades-long hunt that slowly peeled back the layers of an unthinkable tragedy. The silence was eventually broken not by triumphant letters from Franklin, but by horrifying whispers carried out of the frozen wilderness by Inuit hunters. Stories of starving, desperate men wandering like ghosts through a landscape of ice and stone. Stories of madness, and stories that pointed to the ultimate taboo. A truth so repugnant to the Victorian mind that it was publicly denied, suppressed, and condemned for decades. Cannibalism. This is not just the story of a failed expedition. It is the story of what happens when imperial ambition collides with the unforgiving power of nature. It is a detective story, written in scattered bones, in cryptic notes left in stone cairns, and in the scientifically verified cut marks on human remains. It is a journey into the heart of a mystery that has haunted us for generations, forcing us to confront the thin line between civilization and savagery, between heroism and the horrifying will to survive at any cost. For centuries, it was the ultimate geographic prize, a phantom waterway that promised to reshape the world. The Northwest Passage was more than a line on a map. It was the key to a global commercial empire. The logic was simple and seductive. A navigable sea route over the top of North America would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, creating a shortcut that would slash months of time and thousands of miles from the perilous voyages to the lucrative markets of China and the East Indies. For the nation that controlled it, the passage promised unparalleled wealth and strategic power, a northern Gibraltar that would dominate global trade. This dream had driven men and nations to obsession since the late 15th century, almost as soon as they realized the Americas were not Asia, but a massive obstacle standing in the way. The quest became a graveyard of ships and ambitions. John Cabot was lost at sea searching for it. Martin Frobisher battled Inuit and was fooled by a bay that led nowhere. Henry Hudson was cast adrift by a mutinous crew, abandoned to die in the vast icy bay that now bears his name. For 300 years the story was one of failure, of wooden ships and iron men being broken by a landscape of crushing ice and bewildering, identical-looking islands. The Arctic did not yield its secrets easily. By the early 19th century, however, the context had changed. The British Empire, having vanquished Napoleon's France, stood alone as the world's preeminent naval power. The Royal Navy, with its vast resources and thousands of skilled peacetime officers, needed a new purpose to justify its existence. Under the powerful and unwavering direction of Sir John Barrow, the second Secretary to the Admiralty, that purpose became polar exploration. Barrow was the architect of Britain's 19th century Arctic obsession. He believed it was the nation's destiny to solve this final great question of geography. He dispatched a relentless series of expeditions, each one building on the knowledge of the last. William Edward Parry pushed farther west than any man before him, pioneering wintering techniques. John Ross and his nephew James Clark Ross charted vast new territories, locating the North Magnetic Pole in the process. Ruling overland expeditions, led by men like George Back and John Franklin himself, mapped the northern coastline of the continent on foot and by canoe, filling in the bottom edge of the puzzle. By the early 1840s, the map was tantalizingly close to complete. The eastern entrance through Lancaster Sound was known, the western exit into the Beaufort Sea was known. All that remained was a rectangular area of unknown water and ice, a gap of approximately 500 miles between the two. The Admiralty, spurred on by Barrow, decided the time had come for a final, decisive push. They would mount the most technologically advanced, best-supplied expedition in human history to thread the needle and claim the prize that had eluded the world for over 300 years. It was to be the glorious capstone on a century of British naval dominance. An expedition of such national importance required a commander of equal stature. The man chosen by the Admiralty was Captain Sir John Franklin, a figure who, at 59 years old, seemed to be the living embodiment of the Royal Navy's heroic age. His career was a litany of service to the Empire. As a young man, he had fought under Horatio Nelson at the bloody Battle of Copenhagen. He was present at the Battle of Trafalgar, serving on the HMS Bellerophon, where he witnessed the death of Nelson and the total victory that secured Britain's mastery of the seas. He had charted unknown coastlines in Australia and fought against the Americans in the War of 1812. He was a devout, respected, and universally liked officer, known for his kindness and quiet determination. Crucially, Franklin was one of the few senior officers who could claim extensive experience in the very region he was tasked to conquer. He had led 2 monumental overland expeditions to the shores of the Arctic Ocean in the 1820s. The first of these journeys became a legend of suffering and survival. It was a poorly planned and undersupplied disaster that descended into starvation, murder, and cannibalism among his men. Franklin himself was reduced to eating lichen, scraps of hide, and the very leather from his own boots, an ordeal that earned him the enduring public moniker, the man who ate his boot. While horrifying, this experience was framed not as a failure of command, but as a testament to his unbreakable spirit. His second overland expedition was far more successful, a model of planning and execution that mapped a huge stretch of coastline. He had proven he could endure the worst the Arctic could offer. However, his appointment was not a foregone conclusion. Some at the Admiralty worried he was too old, too prone to deliberation, and perhaps not ruthless enough for the task. The most capable polar explorer of the day, James Clark Ross, was offered the command first but turned it down. Franklin, meanwhile, had a powerful personal need for the mission. His recent tenure as the governor of Van Diemen's Land, or modern Tasmania, had ended in political turmoil and a humiliating recall to London. He felt his honor had been stained, and he desperately craved one last great expedition to restore his public standing and secure his legacy. His wife, the formidable and politically astute Lady Jane Franklin, campaigned tirelessly on his behalf. In the end, the Admiralty's tradition of valuing seniority and public reputation won out. Sir John Franklin, the aging hero, would be given his chance at redemption. It was a decision that sent a good man to his doom, and with him 128 souls into the heart of the white unknown. The vessels chosen for this monumental task were not sleek, custom-built explorers. They were war-tested veterans with a history of violence. Erebus and Erebus Terror were bomb vessels, a class of ship designed for a single brutal purpose, to bombard coastal fortifications. Their hulls were built with extraordinary strength, not to withstand ice, but to absorb the violent, deck-shuddering recoil of their heavy mortars. This inherent toughness had already been proven in the most extreme environment on Earth. Both ships were veterans of James Clark Ross's triumphant expedition to Antarctica just a few years earlier, where they had sailed through ice and storms for 4 years, mapping a new continent and reaching farther south than any human had before. They were, without question, the most experienced polar vessels on the planet. For their new mission to the opposite end of the world, they were taken to the Woolwich dockyard and subjected to the most extensive refit imaginable. Massive timbers were added internally, crisscrossing their frames to create a skeleton capable of resisting the immense, slow-motion crushing power of the pack ice. The bows were then sheathed in thick plates of iron, turning them into battering rams designed to split open channels and bully their way through the frozen sea. But the most celebrated innovation was the addition of auxiliary steam power. The Admiralty purchased 2 surplus railway locomotive engines, each one adapted to fit within the crowded confines of the ship's holds. These were not engines designed to power the ships across oceans. Their 25 horsepower was modest, intended only to push the vessels at a steady 4 knots through calm waters, or to navigate leads of open water in the ice fields when the sails were useless. Each engine was connected to a single screw propeller which, in another ingenious innovation, could be retracted up into a protective iron well in the hull to prevent it from being sheared off by shifting ice. They also powered the first ever internal heating systems on a Royal Navy vessel, a network of ducts and pipes designed to keep the crew's living quarters at a comfortable temperature, fighting off the insidious, bone-deep cold of the Arctic winter. The internal space of the ships was a marvel of provisioning. They were loaded with enough food to sustain 129 men for a period of 3 years. This included nearly 32,000 pounds of salt beef and 36,000 pounds of salt pork, enormous quantities of flour, and almost 10,000 pounds of suet and raisins. The cornerstone of this plan, however, was a relatively new technology, canned food. Over 8,000 tin cans of preserved meats, vegetables, and concentrated soups were crammed into the holds. This was seen as the ultimate safeguard against scurvy and starvation, a way to bring the comforts of an English kitchen into the heart of the Arctic. Beyond mere survival, the ships were outfitted for science and morale. They carried libraries containing over 1,000 books each. There were hand organs that played popular tunes. There was even sophisticated photographic equipment, a daguerreotype apparatus, to capture images of their triumph. Erebus and HMS Terror were not just ships. They were floating pieces of Victorian England, designed to conquer the wilderness, not just with strength, but with unwavering confidence and technological superiority. On the morning of May 19, 1845, the expedition departed from Greenhithe on the River Thames. It was a scene of national pride and celebration. Crowds cheered from the shore as HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, accompanied by a supply transport ship, sailed out to sea. The mood was one of supreme optimism. The Illustrated London News declared that the expedition's success was as certain as the revolution of the planets. The journey across the Atlantic was smooth and uneventful. They made a brief stop in the Orkney Islands before heading towards Greenland. There, at the Whalefish Islands in Disco Bay, they took on the last of their fresh provisions from the transport ship. Fresh water was topped up, and 10 live oxen, which had been carried on the decks, were slaughtered and salted down. This was also the last chance for the men to communicate with the outside world. 5 men, deemed medically unfit for the journey ahead, were sent home on the transport ship, reducing the final crew count to 129. The remaining officers and crew wrote their final letters home, letters filled with confidence and anticipation for the adventure ahead. There was no hint of fear, no premonition of the disaster to come. In late July, the 2 expedition ships sailed north into Baffin Bay, towards the entrance of Lancaster Sound, the gateway to the Northwest Passage. It is here that they had their last encounter with other Europeans. 2 whaling vessels, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, were working the bay. The captains of the whaling ships later reported meeting with officers from the Franklin expedition. They described the crew as being in high spirits, full of confident hope of success. Captain Dannett of the Prince of Wales was the last man to speak with them. He recalled seeing the officers dining in their mess, the tables adorned with silver plate, a picture of civilized comfort on the edge of the known world. He noted their confidence and their eagerness to plunge into the ice. On or around the 28th of July, 1845, the whalers watched as Erebus and Terror sailed west, towards the vast shimmering fields of pack ice. They were last seen moored to an iceberg, waiting for the ice to open up and allow them to pass into Lancaster Sound. Then they weighed anchor and disappeared into the white glare of the horizon. It was the last time any of them would be seen alive by the outside world. For the British public and for the families waiting at home, the Great Silence had begun. For the first 2 years, the silence from the north was not alarming. It was expected. The Franklin expedition was provisioned for a 3-year journey, and no one in Britain anticipated a quick return. The public, the Admiralty, and the families of the crew were content to wait, confident that Sir John Franklin was at that very moment masterfully navigating the final stretch of the passage. News would come when he emerged, triumphant, into the Pacific. By the autumn of 1847, however, with 2 winters having passed in the Arctic, the first seeds of anxiety began to sprout. The whaling ships that plied the waters of Baffin Bay returned home with no news. They had seen no sign of the ships, nor heard any word from the local Inuit about them. This was unusual. Even a wintering expedition would typically try to make contact or leave some record. The quiet optimism in Britain began to curdle into a low, persistent hum of concern. The driving force behind the growing demand for answers was Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin. A woman of incredible intelligence, wealth, and relentless determination, she refused to let her husband's mission fade from the public consciousness. She began a tireless campaign of letter-writing, lobbying influential figures and pressuring the Admiralty to prepare for a search. She was a formidable political operator, and her certainty that something was wrong began to sway opinion. The Admiralty, however, was initially resistant. They argued that sending a search party too early would be a fool's errand. Franklin had supplies until the summer of 1848. The Arctic was a vast and dangerous place, and they could not risk more ships and men without concrete reason for alarm. But the pressure from Lady Franklin, combined with that of influential figures like Sir John Barrow and a growing public clamor, became impossible to ignore. By the spring of 1848, with the expedition's 3-year window now closing, the official mood shifted from caution to action. The national project to find the Northwest Passage was transformed into a national obsession to find Sir John Franklin. The Admiralty, finally conceding to the pressure, authorized a massive 3-pronged search effort. It was an undertaking of enormous scale. One search party, under the command of the veteran explorer James Clark Ross, would follow Franklin's intended route into the eastern Arctic through Lancaster Sound. A second ship, HMS Plover, was sent to the other side of the continent, to the Bering Strait, to search for the expedition from the west, hoping to meet them as they emerged from the passage. A third, overland expedition, led by the celebrated naturalist Sir John Richardson, would search the northern coastline of Canada. To fuel the search, the British government offered a staggering reward of £20,000, the equivalent of millions today, for any information leading to the rescue of Franklin's men. Lady Franklin added a further £3,000 from her own fortune. The hunt was on. But as the first search parties returned in 1849 empty-handed and with no news, the mystery only deepened. The nation was now gripped by the terrifying reality that 2 of its finest ships and 129 of its bravest men had been swallowed whole by the ice, leaving not a single trace behind. The man who would finally break the silence was not a Royal Navy officer. He was a different breed of northern explorer entirely. Dr. John Rae was a hardy, pragmatic Scotsman from the Orkney Islands, employed by the Hudson's Bay Company. He was not a naval man bound by rigid hierarchy. He was a frontiersman, a skilled surgeon, and a prodigious surveyor who traveled light and lived off the land. Most importantly, Rae had spent years living and working alongside the indigenous peoples of the North. He respected their knowledge, spoke their language, and had adopted their methods of travel and survival. He could build a snow house and hunt seals, skills that made him far more at home in the Arctic than the naval officers who brought their piece of England with them. In the spring of 1854, nearly a full decade after Franklin had vanished, Rae was not looking for the lost expedition. He was on a mission for his employer, surveying a stretch of the Arctic coast near a place called Pelly Bay. It was here that he encountered a group of local Inuit. Over the years, Rae had built a reputation for fairness and respect, and the Inuit trusted him. One of the hunters, a man named Inuit, recognized a piece of Rae's navigational equipment and asked if it was from a ship. Rae confirmed it was. The hunter then told a shocking story. 4 winters earlier, in 1850, other Inuit had met a party of at least 40 kablooners, or white men, who were traveling south on foot, dragging a boat with them. They were thin, starving, and clearly in desperate trouble. They communicated through gestures that their ships had been crushed by ice, and that they were heading south to find deer to hunt. Later that same season, the Inuit had found the bodies of these men. The story grew darker as Ray pressed for details. He began to trade for items the Inuit had recovered from the dead men. They produced a stunning collection of artifacts, silver forks and spoons belonging to various officers, a small silver plate engraved with Sir John Franklin, buttons from naval uniforms, and parts of scientific instruments. The evidence was undeniable. This was the fate of the Franklin expedition. Ray then asked the most dreadful question of all. How had these men died? The Inuit described finding around 30 bodies at a camp on the mainland, and 5 more on a nearby island. Some were in tents, some lay where they had fallen. They were dead from starvation. And then came the final, horrifying revelation. The Inuit told Ray, in clear and unmistakable terms, that from the mutilated state of many of the corpses and the contents of the cooking kettles, it was evident that the last survivors had been driven to the ultimate taboo to stay alive. Dr. John Ray, the practical man of science, meticulously recorded the testimony. He purchased all the relics he could as proof. He had solved the great mystery. He knew what had happened to Franklin's men. But the truth he now carried back towards London was a whisper of such horror that he knew it would not be celebrated as a discovery, but condemned as an attack on the honor of the nation and its heroes. When Dr. John Ray returned to London in October of 1854, he went directly to the Admiralty. He presented his report and the artifacts he had purchased, laying out the grim evidence in a clear, dispassionate manner. The reaction from the Lords of the Admiralty was one of profound shock and revulsion. They had finally solved the mystery of the Franklin expedition, but the answer was so horrifying it was deemed unfit for public consumption. The problem was not just the death of the men, but the manner of their survival. For the Victorian mind, cannibalism was the ultimate marker of savagery, the absolute antithesis of what it meant to be a civilized Englishman. The idea that officers and men of the Royal Navy, the very symbol of British discipline, character, and global supremacy, could descend to such a level was unthinkable. It struck at the very heart of their national identity and their belief in their own innate superiority. The Admiralty, forced to release the news, tried to bury the most disturbing detail. But the story was too sensational. When the full report became public, it ignited a firestorm of outrage. The target of this fury was not the crushing ice or the failed provisions, but the messenger himself, Dr. John Ray, and his Inuit witnesses. Leading the charge against the truth was Lady Jane Franklin. Consumed by the need to protect her husband's heroic legacy, she utterly rejected the Inuit testimony. She, along with much of the British establishment, launched a campaign to discredit Ray and portray the Inuit as untrustworthy, primitive liars who had likely murdered Franklin's men themselves and invented the story of cannibalism to cover their crime. Her most powerful ally in this campaign was the most famous author in the English-speaking world, Charles Dickens. A personal friend of the Franklin family, Dickens was deeply offended by what he saw as a slander against the character of the British sailor. He used his immensely popular magazine, Household Words, to launch a series of scathing attacks on Ray's report. Dickens argued with passionate conviction that it was a moral impossibility for civilized Christian men of the Royal Navy to have resorted to such a last resource. He painted the Inuit as a gross handful of uncivilized people, covetous, treacherous, and cruel, suggesting they were the true villains of the story. He created an alternate narrative, one where Franklin's men died as noble heroes and the Inuit were murderous scavengers. The influence of Charles Dickens was immense. His words shaped public opinion far more effectively than any official report from the Admiralty. The nation, desperate to preserve its heroic myth, chose to believe the comforting fiction offered by its favorite novelist over the unspeakable truth delivered by the Hudson's Bay Company doctor. Dr. John Ray, the man who had solved the riddle of the lost expedition, saw his reputation tarnished and his character questioned. The Admiralty awarded him the £10,000 reward he was owed, but they did so grudgingly. The true story of the Franklin expedition was officially buried under a mountain of prejudice and nationalistic denial. The search, however, was not over. Lady Franklin now needed more than just answers. She needed proof that her version of the story was true. While the public debate raged, Lady Franklin channeled her grief and fortune into one final private search effort. She was determined to find concrete evidence of her husband's fate, to locate his ships, and above all, to find records that would vindicate the honor of his men and cement their status as Christian heroes. She purchased a steam yacht, the Fox, and chose a quiet, deeply competent naval officer, Captain Francis Leopold McClintock, to lead the expedition. McClintock was the perfect man for the job. He was a veteran of the earlier search expeditions and had become a master of Arctic sledge travel, learning from the methods of both Dr. Ray and the Inuit. He set out in 1857 with a singular focus to search the one area all previous signs had pointed to, the vicinity of King William Island. After wintering in the ice, McClintock began his search in the spring of 1859. His strategy was methodical, dispatching multiple sledging parties to search the island's coastline. He and his men interviewed local Inuit, who provided them with more stories of the white men's doomed march, and pointed them towards key locations. The breakthrough came on May 24, 1859. A sledging party led by Lieutenant William Hobson was exploring the western coast of King William Island. Near a desolate spot they named Victory Point, they discovered a large, man-made stone cairn. Buried within the pile of rocks was a small tin cylinder. With trembling frozen fingers, Hobson opened it. Inside was a standard-issue Admiralty form. It was the holy grail of the Franklin search, a written message from the lost expedition. The document contained two separate entries. The first, written in a neat, confident hand, was dated May 28, 1847. It was a routine update. It recorded that HMS Erebus and Terror had wintered at Beechey Island after circumnavigating Cornwallis Island. It stated that the expedition had ascended the Wellington Channel and returned by the west side of Cornwallis Island. It ended with the cheerful, heartbreakingly mundane phrase, "All well." It was signed by an officer and noted that Sir John Franklin was still in command. But around the margins of this same piece of paper, a second, more desperate message had been scrawled. This entry was dated almost a year later, April 25, 1848. In a few terse, frantic sentences, it laid the entire tragedy bare. The note stated that the ships had been beset in the ice since September 12, 1846, just a few miles north of that very spot. It then delivered the most stunning news of all. Sir John Franklin had died on June 11, 1847, just 2 weeks after the "All Well" message had been written. The note continued. The ships had been deserted on April 22, 1848. A total of 9 officers and 15 men had already died. The surviving 105 souls, now under the command of Captain Francis Crozier, were abandoning the ships and starting a desperate march south towards the Great Fish River on the mainland. This single piece of paper was a frozen snapshot of doom. It was the only official record of the expedition's fate ever found. It confirmed the disaster, the death of Franklin, and the location of the ships. Crucially, it confirmed that the survivors were heading in the exact direction the Inuit had told Dr. Ray they had seen them 5 years earlier. The note provided the cold, hard facts that proved the Inuit testimony had been true all along. The heroic myth crafted by Charles Dickens had been shattered by a few lines of pencil on a fading government form. The note in the cairn gave McClintock and his men a map of the tragedy. Following the route south from Victory Point, they began to uncover the grim reality of the crew's final march. The trail of evidence was sparse, but what they found painted a picture of utter desperation and collapse. Scattered along the desolate coastline were items cast aside by men who were weakening by the day. They found scraps of clothing, naval equipment, and personal belongings. Each item was a small, silent testament to a man shedding weight, abandoning anything that was not essential for survival as he stumbled south. The most haunting discovery was made by McClintock himself. At a place now known as Erebus Bay, he came across a large, heavy boat, mounted on a massive sledge. Dragging this boat which weighed over 1,400 pounds empty, was a task of unimaginable labor, a sign of the crew's desperate hope of reaching a river. Inside the boat, they made a truly macabre find. There were two skeletons, one in the bow and one in the stern. The remains were partially dismembered and scattered. Alongside them lay a shocking collection of items: watches, silver spoons, prayer books, and silk handkerchiefs. The men had clung to the symbols of their civilization, even as their bodies failed them. The boat also contained an abundance of bizarre and useless items for a desperate march. There were button polish, slippers, and scented soap. This strange cargo spoke not of a well-planned survival trek, but of a breakdown in command and rational thought. Men, likely addled by starvation and sickness, had packed keepsakes and comforts instead of life-saving supplies. Further south, McClintock's second-in-command, Lieutenant Hobson, discovered another skeleton. It was a single man lying face down, who had apparently fallen and died as he walked. He was identified by his clothing as a ship's steward. Over the next century and a half, more remains would be found. The bleak, windswept shores of King William Island became an open-air graveyard. Dozens of skeletons have been located, some alone, some in small groups, all telling the same story written in the note: a doomed march south by men who were already dead on their feet. The island had revealed the what and the where of the disaster, but the most profound questions remained unanswered. What had killed these men so quickly? Why did a perfectly supplied expedition with the best technology of its day collapse into starvation and death so catastrophically? The clues lay not just on the shore, but buried deep in the frozen ground hundreds of miles away. For more than 130 years, the Franklin mystery remained a story told by scattered bones and a single, fading note. The precise medical cause of the disaster was a matter of speculation. That changed in the 1980s when a Canadian forensic anthropologist named Dr. Owen Beatty decided to look for answers not in historical records, but in the bodies of the dead themselves. Beatty theorized that the crew's rapid decline could not be explained by scurvy and starvation alone. Something else, some other factor, must have been at play. He turned his attention to the very first casualties of the expedition: the 3 men who had died during the first winter of 1845–46 and were buried on Beechey Island long before the ships were trapped and abandoned. These 3 men were Petty Officer John Torrington, Royal Marine William Brain, and able-bodied seaman John Hartnell. Their deaths were recorded in the "All Well" portion of the Victory Point note, and their graves, marked by ornate wooden headstones, were well known. Beatty reasoned that if some hidden poison was at work, it might be present even in these earliest victims. In August of 1984, Beatty and his team arrived on Beechey Island with a difficult goal: to exhume the bodies of these 3 sailors. It was a race against time, working in the brief Arctic summer. Using picks and shovels, they began to dig through the rock-hard permafrost. As they dug deeper, they began to hit solid ice. The coffins had been buried deep enough to be encased in a lens of ice, turning them into natural freezers. After hours of painstaking work, they managed to raise the first coffin, that of John Torrington, to the surface. The team used kettles of hot water to carefully melt the ice that sealed the coffin lid. When they finally lifted it, they were met with a sight that was both scientifically stunning and deeply human. Staring back at them from across the centuries was the face of John Torrington. He was not a skeleton. He was perfectly preserved. His eyes were open, his skin was intact, and he was still wrapped in his burial shroud. The permafrost had arrested the process of decay almost completely. The team was looking at a man who had died 138 years ago, as if he had died only yesterday. They performed a careful autopsy on the frozen body right there on the tundra. They took tissue and bone samples for later analysis back in the lab. 2 years later, they returned and did the same for Brain and Hartnell, who were also found in a remarkable state of preservation. The haunting images of these frozen sailors, especially the gaunt, wide-eyed face of John Torrington, were broadcast around the world. They put a human face on the tragedy in a way no skeleton ever could, but it was the invisible evidence, locked deep within their bones, that would finally provide the first key to unlocking the medical mystery of what truly destroyed the Franklin expedition. Back in his laboratory at the University of Alberta, Dr. Owen Beatty and his team began the painstaking analysis of the tissue, hair, and bone samples taken from the 3 frozen sailors of Beechey Island. When the results came back, they were shocking. The levels of lead in the men's bodies were astronomically high. In John Torrington's hair, the lead levels were more than 60 times greater than what would be expected in a healthy person from that era. The levels were so extreme that they indicated a massive and ongoing exposure to lead from the very beginning of the voyage. This was the hidden factor Beatty had been searching for. The men were being systematically poisoned. The question was, from where? The answer lay in one of the expedition's most celebrated technologies, the 8,000 tins of canned food. The canning process was relatively new in the 1840s. To meet the massive order for the Franklin expedition, the contractor, a man named Stephen Goldner, had rushed the job. Instead of using proper techniques, his workers had sloppily soldered the seams on the inside of the cans with thick beads of lead. Every time a can was filled with meat, soup, or vegetables, the food sat in direct contact with this lead solder. Over the months and years spent in the ship's hold, the lead leached directly into the food. With every meal the men ate, they were ingesting a dose of poison. The very provisions meant to protect them from starvation and scurvy were insidiously weakening them from within. Lead poisoning is a devastatingly subtle affliction. It doesn't kill quickly. Instead, it attacks the entire body, causing anemia, muscle weakness, and severe joint pain. Critically, it also attacks the nervous system. The symptoms include confusion, cognitive decline, paranoia, and an inability to make rational decisions. The men would have become progressively weaker, more confused, and less capable of dealing with the immense challenges of their environment. This poisoning created the perfect storm for disaster. The men, weakened by lead, would have been far more susceptible to the effects of scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C that was already a known killer on long voyages. The physical weakness and mental decay would have made them less able to perform the hard labor required to manage the ships or hunt for fresh game, which would have provided the vitamin C they needed. The expedition didn't fail because of one single cause. It was a cascade of calamities. Lead poisoning started the process, weakening the men's bodies and minds. This accelerated the onset of scurvy, which further debilitated them. This deadly combination, born from a faulty food supply, ultimately led to the final fatal outcome, starvation, on the desolate shores of King William Island. While the lead poisoning theory explained why the expedition collapsed, it did not address the most controversial part of the story, the Inuit testimony of cannibalism, which had been so vehemently denied by Victorian society. For over a century, the official narrative was that the men had died as heroes. The truth required moving beyond the frozen graves of Beechey Island to the scattered bones on King William Island. After his work on the frozen bodies, Owen Beatty turned his forensic expertise to the skeletal remains of the men who had died during the final march south. He and his team examined bones that had been collected by searchers over the previous decades, applying modern forensic techniques to look for evidence that had been previously overlooked. Under the microscope, the bones began to tell their silent, terrible story. Beatty discovered a pattern of distinct marks that were not caused by animal scavengers. He found hundreds of fine parallel scratches on the bones, consistent with the use of knives to methodically remove the flesh from the skeleton. This was defleshing. He also identified heavier V-shaped incisions located at the body's major joints at the shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees. This was clear evidence of systematic dismemberment, the deliberate cutting apart of the bodies into smaller, more manageable portions. The most chilling discovery of all was something forensic anthropologists call pot polishing. The ends of many of the larger bones were broken open and had a distinctive, smoothed, almost polished appearance. This occurs when bones are placed in a cooking pot and stirred in boiling water. This is done to render the last possible calorie of nutrition from the bone marrow. Taken together, this evidence was irrefutable. The cut marks, the dismemberment, and the pot polishing constituted a textbook forensic signature of survival cannibalism. It was not a sign of madness or savagery, but of a final, desperate attempt by starving men to stay alive in the only way left to them. The science was definitive. It proved beyond any doubt that the stories the Inuit had told Dr. John Ray in 1854 were entirely true. Their testimony, which had been dismissed for over 130 years as the lies of untrustworthy savages, was vindicated by the cold, hard evidence written on the bones of the dead. The final, unspeakable truth of the Franklin expedition was no longer a matter of debate, but a settled, scientific fact. For over 160 years, the final resting places of HMS Erebus and Terror remained the last great secret of the Franklin mystery. The ships were the largest missing objects in the Canadian Arctic, and finding them became a new quest, driven by archaeologists, historians, and the Canadian government. Beginning in 2008, Parks Canada led a massive state-of-the-art search effort, employing icebreakers, survey launches, and advanced sonar technology. Crucially, this modern search was different from those of the 19th century in one fundamental way: it was built on a partnership with the Inuit. Researchers now understood that Inuit oral history, dismissed for so long, was not a collection of myths but a vital and accurate historical record. They pored over 19th century testimonies and listened to modern Inuit elders whose ancestors had passed down stories of the ships and their crews for generations. These stories provided the essential clues. Inuit accounts described one ship sinking in the ice-choked waters west of King William Island, while another drifted south, where one elder recalled his grandfather seeing it. This focus on Inuit knowledge dramatically narrowed the vast search area. The breakthrough came on September 2, 2014. The Parks Canada search team, acting on a clue from Inuit historians, was surveying a small island in the Queen Maud Gulf, south of King William Island. An archaeologist walking the shoreline found a Davy Pintle, a metal part of a ship's boat launching crane. It was stamped with the Royal Navy's broad arrow insignia. They were in the right place. 5 days later, using high-resolution side-scan sonar, the team got the image they had been dreaming of. There, sitting upright on the seabed in only 11 meters of water, was the unmistakable shape of a British sailing vessel. It was a ghost ship, resting silently on the ocean floor. Divers were sent down and they soon confirmed its identity. It was HMS Erebus, Sir John Franklin's flagship. The ship had been found, not where Victorian searchers had looked, but precisely where Inuit knowledge had said it would be. The first of the sunken ghosts had finally been located. The discovery of Erebus was a monumental achievement, but it left a lingering question. Where was its companion, HMS Terror? The search continued, now focused on an area north of Erebus's location. But once again, the key would come not from a computer model, but from a human story. The crucial piece of the puzzle was provided by Sammy Kogvik, an Inuit Canadian ranger and a member of the search team. In 2016, while aboard the research vessel Martin Bergman, Kogvik shared a story. Years earlier, while snowmobiling with a friend, he had spotted a large piece of wood, which looked like a ship's mast, sticking out of the sea ice. It was in a place far from the official search area, a deep, uncharted bay on the southern coast of King William Island. Intrigued by Kogvik's story, the crew of the Martin Bergman decided to take a detour from their planned route and investigate the hunch. They navigated their vessel into the bay, a place that would soon be named Terror Bay. They deployed their sonar equipment, and within hours, they found it. The discovery was breathtaking. Lying in 24 meters of water, HMS Terror was in a state of almost unbelievable preservation. It was sitting perfectly upright, its 3 masts still standing, its bowsprit intact. It looked as though it had simply sailed to the bottom of the sea. The cold, dark, still water had created a perfect time capsule. Using remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, archaeologists began to explore the wreck. The images they sent back were stunning. Windows were intact, the ship's bell was in place, and heavy cannons were still sealed in their gun ports. The ROV peered into the officers' cabins, revealing plates and glass bottles sitting on shelves, exactly where they had been left 170 years before. They explored Captain Crozier's cabin and found it filled with scientific instruments and map cabinets, their drawers tantalizingly closed. perhaps holding the final written records of the expedition. The Terror was not just a wreck, it was a ghost ship, a floating museum waiting to be explored, promising to finally reveal the last secrets of its doomed voyage. The story of the Franklin expedition is a story of ambition that begins in the halls of the British Admiralty and ends with 2 sunken ships resting on the floor of the Arctic Ocean. It is a tragedy woven from 3 distinct threads: heroism, hubris, and horror. The heroism is undeniable. It is found in the courage of 129 men venturing into the world's most hostile environment. It is in their endurance through 3 years of isolation and hardship, and in the final desperate march south. It is in the relentless dedication of searchers like John Ray and Leopold McClintock, and in the quiet resilience of Lady Jane Franklin. The hubris is equally clear. It was the hubris of an empire at the peak of its power, so confident in its technology and superiority that it believed it could conquer nature itself. It was the hubris of sending men into an environment they did not understand, equipped with provisions that poisoned them. And it was the profound cultural hubris that led the Victorian establishment to reject the truth when it was offered to them, choosing to slander the Inuit rather than accept a reality that tarnished their heroic myth. And finally, there is the horror. It is the slow, creeping horror of lead poisoning, clouding the mind and weakening the body. It is the agony of scurvy and the gnawing pain of starvation. And it is the horror of the final terrible choice made by the last survivors on the shores of King William Island, a truth confirmed not by conjecture, but by the cold, hard science of cut marks on bone. In the end, the discovery of Erebus and Terror brings the story full circle. The ships were found only when modern science finally embraced the indigenous knowledge it had once dismissed. The Inuit, whose ancestors witnessed the tragedy and preserved its memory for generations, became the final key to unlocking the mystery. The sunken ghosts of the Northwest Passage do not just tell a story of a failed expedition. They offer a timeless and humbling lesson about the clash between human ambition and the enduring power of the natural world, and the quiet, persistent strength of truth.